Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And as we get started, I imagine there may be a few other people who join us. But given how short this session is, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Roy Reamer, and I've met some of you, but not all of you. I'm the executive director here at Zen Caregiving Project, formerly Zen Hospice Project. And I've worked with this organization since 1997 when I first came on as a volunteer caregiver. And I've held a number of different roles, and I'm now the ED. Um, since 1997, when I started serving at the bedside of people living with terminal illness, this has really been an ongoing practice of passion. And this practice has served and supported every aspect of my life. Um, Compassion really knows no boundaries. So it was developed at the bedside, but I found it really changed the way I was living my life in all areas of my life. So that's who I am, a little bit about who I am. I wanted to encourage you all to use the chat function to pose any questions if anything's unclear that I share, or if you have any questions that haven't yet been addressed. And I'll be leaving time at the end of the session to address questions. So as we get started, I really want to acknowledge, this moment that we're in. If any of you are living out here on the West Coast, not only have we been dealing with COVID and its impacts in just about every aspect of our lives, but now we're dealing with these fires and the smoke. And it's been really, really challenging lately out here. Yesterday, it didn't really get light all day long. It was just this very strange orange haze everywhere we looked. And it was really disconcerting. And it was really difficult to hold with everything else that's been going on. So I want to name that, many of us are really feeling the challenges of this particular. There's a lot of anxiety and a lot of uncertainty. And when we're dealing with such circumstances, our compassion can begin to shut down, actually. And that's what we're going to spend time talking about today. So, just to give an overview of the session, I'll offer a very quick review of what mindfulness practice is, talk about how mindfulness relates to compassion. They're very closely related, and I'll say more about that. And then I'll say something about how compassion can be applied to our current circumstances to support our resiliency and to support those around us. And then we'll do a meditation together. And I think what I'll do is I'll make what we call a self-compassion break part of our meditation session together. And then we'll go into comments and questions, and we'll end our time together as close to 1:15 as possible. I'll end the session by sharing a poem. Okay, so mindfulness. If you've been with us before, you've heard my definition of mindfulness, but for any of you who are joining us for the first time, I'll just say that I like to define mindfulness as paying attention to the present moment on purpose without judgment. So paying attention to the present moment on purpose without judgment. And this piece around on purpose is simply, noticing when we become distraction is quite natural and common. And so as we develop our mindfulness practice, we get really good at noticing when our attention gets distracted by discursive thoughts, by different stimuli in the field of our awareness, anything that really distracts the focus of our attention. And when we notice we're distracted, we come back to the focus of our attention. And we do this again and again. And so the without judgment piece is just, simply remembering that when we become distracted, it's really no big deal. We just drop whatever's distracting us and come back to the focus of our attention. So there are, several ways to cultivate mindfulness. The most obvious is probably meditation, a meditation practice. But the good news is, um, we don't really need to become hardcore meditation practitioners to cultivate mindfulness. If you were able to integrate into your daily routine a meditation period, that would be wonderful. But if you find at this point in your life you're just not able to do that, you're still presented with opportunities throughout your day to develop uh, presence, awareness, and mindfulness. And we do this by simply focusing on whatever activity we're engaged in, or by focusing on the physical sensations in the body. So we always have access to the physical sensations, to the breath, and by carefully focusing our attention, this is how we develop this ability to be mindful and present, no matter what's happening around us, no matter the circumstances we find ourselves in. So, mindfulness is an essential component of compassion. I think of compassion as a dynamic process, actually, with different stages or components. And really, the first component is, in fact, awareness or mindfulness, just being aware of the suffering that's taking place around us and within ourselves. And so I think it's fair to say if you're not aware of suffering, then you won't experience the other components of compassion. You won't experience, you will not experience the desire to see suffering alleviated or lessened, and you will not act to alleviate. So, really, the first step is really seeing what's happening and noticing the suffering around us. And it may seem a little crazy to suggest that in this time of so much suffering around us that we wouldn't see what's happening. But actually, a lot of us move through the world turning away from the suffering that we see around us. Um, this could be from feeling like we have to protect ourselves. It may be because we're feeling overwhelmed by the amount of suffering that we're seeing. But as we build our compassion, we build our capacity to really be with the suffering that and acknowledging the suffering that we're witnessing around us really does require, I would say, that we have tools to use to cope with what takes place next. In other words, um, it requires that we have tools to then respond to the empathetic response by recognizing a clear intention to alleviate suffering and then acting to do something about it. So the tools to hold the enormity of the suffering that we witness. And without these tools, it's very, very easy to become overwhelmed. And when we become overwhelmed by the amount of suffering we see, we experience what's commonly referred to as a compassion fade. Um, our compassion actually decreases. We'll talk more about that in a second. But yeah, mindfulness is a tool, and it's a skill for coping with our emotional response to the suffering we see. So when we have a big emotional response to a situation or suffering we witness, by paying attention to what's happening in the body in response to what we're seeing, in response to the emotions, we build a capacity to let the emotions um, process and run their course. And I would say that it really requires that we can actually stop and pay attention to what's happening in the body. Um, I had or an experience of this just yesterday. So we woke up to these orange skies. It was very dark, very bizarre. And I went out to walk my dog, Louie, at about 7:30 in the morning. And it had actually started getting even darker than it was when I first woke up. And here I was walking down the street with my dog, and I started to feel really overwhelmed. I felt like I was unable in that moment to really integrate what I was experiencing in the environment around me. I couldn't quite make sense out of it. And I noticed my thoughts were going to, well, how bad is this going to get? Am I healthy out here? What's going to happen during the rest of the day? These thoughts caused a real distress, some really strong emotions in my body. And in that moment, I just completely turned my attention toward what was happening in the body. I was sensing the feeling of my feet touching the surface of the sidewalk as I walked along. And in this way of dropping the thoughts that were really a projection into the future, but focusing on exactly what was happening in the body, I was able to let these emotions just take their course. It wasn't a denial of my emotions. It was full recognition and attention to the emotions. And in this way, I found I was able to continue walking, really focus on why I was out there with Louie, take this walk and head on home. So the moment played itself out. And I think it really speaks to this ability to just pay attention to what's really happening and drop the thoughts that in our speculation of what could happen. So in that example, I think what was happening was I was being really honest with myself about what was happening. And I think mindfulness really does require that we're really honest with ourselves. It really allows us to see things exactly as they are and to not turn away. So In a moment like that, when we're feeling overwhelmed, perhaps we even say to ourselves, ah, this is what overwhelm feels like, or ah, this is what sadness feels like, right? And to really sense it in the body. So, what happens when we experience overwhelm? What can we do to respond to the experience or feeling of overwhelm? When maybe our compassion starts to feel blocked because things feel so big, so beyond our control. Well, there are a few things that I find really helpful. And one is to just remember that every action, whether it's big or small, makes a difference. So often we can feel like we can't make a difference because what we're able to do is insignificant. Well, I think it's helpful to remember that anything we do can make a difference. And when we even offer a small act of compassion, when it's witnessed by others, they actually derive the benefits of compassion. So, compassion is actually what I would describe as a contagion. So, there are three beneficiaries in an act of compassion. There's the one who's expressing the compassion, who benefits. There's the one who receives the act of compassion, who benefits. And then there are those who witness the act of compassion. They actually benefit as well. So when we remember that every action makes a difference, um, we actually don't have to worry about comparing what we do to what others are doing, right? So that comparing mind can be a real obstacle. So dropping the comparison, I think, really helps. And, we start small, whatever we can do. Also, I would say it's really helpful to focus locally, right? So look at the suffering that's taking place directly around you rather than focusing on the large scale suffering. And so, a good way to do this, I find, is limiting the input of mass media or limit the media that we're taking in. And it helps to turn toward your neighborhood, your friends and family. This can really help. And we can start there. And our own ability to be mindful and compassion serves as a real support to those in our life. Also, reminding yourself of how you make meaning in your life. How do you find meaning in your life? And if you were with us previously, we engaged in an activity of affirming values. So part of this making meaning is to um, remind yourself of what your most deeply held values are. And in this, we're kind of reminded of what really matters. And this helps actually regain whatever compassion that may fade due to feeling overwhelmed, right? So you could ask yourself, how might I express these values in this challenging time, right? How might I express these deeply held values in this challenging time? This can really help. To ask yourself how you really want to show up for these circumstances that are creating so much of the suffering we're seeing in the world around us. So, how do you want to show up for this? This kind of stepping back and observing yourself and asking yourself who you want to be in the midst of this. So, who do you want to be in this time of COVID, in this time of the fires, this time of so much uncertainty in the world around us? And finally, remember that you're not alone. You're not alone in your feelings of overwhelm. If you're feeling it, most likely others are feeling it. And this can really help because so often when we're feeling overwhelmed, we can feel contracted and actually isolated, right? So just this simple act of reminding ourselves that because we're human, we will suffer and we're not alone in this. So self-compassion. Um, this is another tool to meet suffering, our own suffering. So we are relational beings, and when others suffer, we suffer too. Um, it really can't be avoided. We're all in this together. And in the Buddhist teachings, anyways, we're taught that to be human means we will suffer. That's just part of the deal, right? It's just part of the program of being here and living this life. And if we're unable to offer compassion to ourselves when we suffer, I'd say it's pretty likely we're going to have a difficult time offering compassion to others when we witness suffering. So when we're feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of the suffering we're witnessing, can we start with ourselves? Can we acknowledge that this is really hard, that I'm suffering and I'm not alone? So a local meditation teacher, Jack Hornfield, says, if your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete. So I love that quote. I use that quote from Jack a lot. So our compassion has to really include ourself. So there are three essential components to self-compassion. And the first one is, as we spoke of, it's awareness, So can I notice and acknowledge that in this moment I'm suffering, right? So awareness of our own suffering. And then secondly, this idea that we're not alone, as I mentioned, this idea of shared common humanity, right? So we all suffer. And this, I think, really helps. And then the third component to self-compassion is kindness. So when I notice I'm suffering and I remember I'm not alone, can I extend kindness to myself, right? Can I feel worthy of my own kindness? And for some of us, this is really quite challenging, just due to our conditioning as we've grown up. But kindness. So compassion is active and very dynamic. It really does involve or require action. And compassion towards ourselves, at the very least, can include the action of just being kind to ourselves, right? So we'll try this out together now. So let's get into a posture that we can maintain for about 5, maybe 10 minutes. And we'll do some meditation together, and we'll engage in, again, what I mentioned was called the self-compassion break. And I want to give a call out to Kristen Neff, who has a wonderful book on self-compassion. And she does a lot of work around this practice of self-compassion. So just maybe putting down anything that you're holding in your hands and just letting your hands find their way into stillness. And if it's comfortable for you, you can close your eyes or leave them open. It's really up to you. And just bring yourself into a comfortable posture that you can maintain for a few minutes. And begin to just gently let your attention find its way to the breath. Just noticing the in breath and the out breath. No need to change your breathing pattern, just noticing. What sensations do you notice as you breathe in and as you breathe out? The breath can serve as an anchor for our attention when we're feeling busy, when we're feeling distracted, overwhelmed. And every time distracting thoughts arise, just letting them go and returning to the breath. Maybe noticing your feet on the floor, if your feet are touching the floor, or noticing the sensation of your feet wrapped in your socks and shoes. Feeling this groundedness. And now let yourself think about a situation in your life that you're finding challenging. Um, Maybe you let your mind touch upon the enormity of the circumstances so many of us are facing these days. And just for a moment, letting yourself really take in the enormity of everything that's going on around us and causing so much suffering. And still staying anchored in the breath, in the body, as you think about and consider all the things that are going on in the world around us. Notice if you're experiencing any kind of reaction in the body. And now, if it's comfortable for you, repeating to yourself silently, this is a moment of suffering. This is a moment of suffering. If it's comfortable for you, you might even place a hand or both hands over your heart. And again, repeat to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. This is a moment of struggle. Maybe you say, this is challenging. This is difficult. Whatever's true for you. Just really acknowledging what's happening in this moment. And then as you attune to what's happening in the body, as you acknowledge that this is a moment of suffering, saying to yourself silently, suffering is not easy, but it's really a part of life. Suffering is a part of life, and I am not alone. Others are struggling also. Suffering is not easy, but it is a part of life, and others are suffering too. I am not alone. This reminder that we're all in this together. And then, in an effort to just simply be kind to ourselves, silently saying to yourself, may I be kind to myself in this moment. May I be kind to myself in this moment. Even noticing any kind of resistance, noticing any doubt, but really trying this on. Recognizing the worthiness or how much you deserve to be the recipient of your own kindness. And remembering that this is an act of compassion, this willingness, this ability to direct kindness at yourself in a moment of struggle. This is no small thing. And now, leaving your hands where they are, or bringing them back into your lap, letting yourself return your attention back to the breath. Letting yourself feel the grounding of your feet upon the floor or whatever surface they're resting upon. And as we end, maybe even acknowledging to yourself the usefulness of taking time out to just focus on what's happening right here, right now, and to extend to yourself kindness and compassion. And in your own time, opening your eyes and maybe shifting in your seat if that feels necessary, stretching. I'm going to take a sip of tea. So that's what we call the self-compassion break. And I know a couple of you have um, practiced with that before, and I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on the practice or what impressions you have from engaging in that practice. But to finish up, so just acknowledging that these are really difficult times and no one knows how things are going to unfold. And this creates so much uncertainty. And our capacity to be with suffering and to ground ourselves in the present moment is a huge support to those around us who are really suffering. And let us remember that overwhelm is quite natural, and I would say even to be expected. And a healthy response is practicing mindful awareness and compassion, and remembering that each moment is an opportunity to begin again, right? So we're not alone in our struggles and in our attempts to just manage these difficult times, and we're deserving of our own kindness. So with that, I'd like to transition into time to answer any questions or hear from you, any comments that you have about this topic or anything that you've heard up until now. And here's where I'll ask Lev for some assistance. Actually, if you have a comment, I think if you kind of wave your hand, um, we'll be able to take you off mute. And Lev, I'm not sure if we have any questions in the chat. Not yet. Okay. So I'd love to know how others are coping during these challenging times. What are you finding that works for you? So, if I may, Joan writes, I have never thought of being overwhelmed as suffering, and this helped immensely. I, I think this feeling of overwhelm is definitely a form of our suffering. Yeah. You know, this difficulty to really integrate everything that's going on around us. This feeling, and I'm talking about my own experience, but this feeling of helplessness.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Joan, what do you do in those moments? Find helps.
Well, I haven't been practicing the mindfulness lately, so this is a great reminder. I've been better about it, but not totally aware. And today's been one of those days with my job that it's just, I had 2 phones ringing first thing this morning. I had 3 or 4 different emails to check and respond to. So COVID is really catching up with us here in Texas as far as the bereavement, the grief, the coping skills that I try and teach others. So this has been a great reminder in being able to help others.
Good.
So,
Yeah. And thank you for that great work you're doing there with
thank you.
the bereaved. Yeah. Yeah, you know, in my moments of intense overwhelm, which happens, what I find is if I can just stop, you know, follow a few breaths, feel my feet on the floor, you know, that's something I can do, right? And it just brings a moment of clarity. And then, as I said, you know, I can begin again. Okay, so what do I do next, right? What's the next step? I can't deal with it all right now. It's just too much, but there is something I can do next, and then something after that. And so that starting place of the breath, the body really helps. We have a comment from Barbara. Thank you, Barbara. I agree, feeling overwhelmed lately, but not have not been before. I am working from home and feel I am pushing thoughts and behaviors around with no completion. Yeah. Leading bereavement support groups as well, not functioning as well. Yeah, you're probably describing what many of us are experiencing these days. Yeah, and I've mentioned before, but again, you know, there's this wonderful practice called the stop practice. So in those moments where we're just pushing a lot around without completion, can we stop? So the S, just stop. The T is to take a breath, right? Stop, take a breath. O, observe. Like, what's happening here? What do I notice in the body? What do I notice in the environment around me? And the P is then proceed. So from that place of just pausing, because we get so caught up in things, we forget to just pause. Yeah. So I always like to remind us, this is a practice. So um, even if you're someone who's been working with meditation and mindfulness for years, you know that you lose contact with these basic practices and then stop and begin again, right? So this is why we call it a practice, constantly practicing. Yeah. Anyone else? Any thoughts, questions? Okay. Well, again, I want to just thank you all for taking the time out of your busy lives for this. And I hope this was useful. And I wish you all well in your practices, in your life, in your work. And if you're here today, then I trust, um, you're the kind of person who's looking for this kind of growth in those values that you considered. This kind of growth and development is one of them. Um, so we are a nonprofit, and while I know a lot of people out there are struggling financially these days, if you are in a position to support these free sessions, please do go to our website, make a donation if you can, but also, tell others about our classes, about our free sessions. This is a really good way to support our work. So thank you for that. And I'm going to finish with a poem. And let's see if I can locate this. Ah, yeah. So, what a beautiful expression of compassion I think this is. This is a poem titled In the Storm. And this one comes from the great poet Mary Oliver. So, some black ducks were shrugged up on the shore. It was snowing hard in the east, and the sea was in disorder. Then some sanderlings, 5 inches long, with beaks like wire, flew in, snowflakes on their backs, and settled in a row behind the ducks, whose backs were also covered with snow. So close, they were all but touching. They were all but under the roof of the ducks' tails. So the wind pretty much blew over them. They stayed that way, motionless. Out over the water, which was still raging, but somehow they came back. And again, the ducks, like a feathered hedge, let them stoop there and live. If someone you didn't know told you this, as I am telling you this, would you believe it? Belief isn't always easy, but this much I have learned. If not enough else, to live with my eyes open, I know what everyone wants is a miracle. This wasn't a miracle unless, of course, kindness, as now and again some rare person has suggested, is a miracle, as it surely is. So, kindness as a miracle. So, yeah, may you have many miracles these days. So, thank you for being here, and we'll look forward to seeing you again.